So I'm pleased to introduce Susan McMahon for the 23-24 CSH Excellence in Research Award for a senior scholar. I've known Susan McMahon since she began her doctoral education in 1991. In the last 2 decades, I've served as her department chair, associate dean for research, colleague, and research collaborator. She's one of the most talented scientists whom I have known in a half a century plus in the academy. Her research strengths reflect the substance, quality, originality, positive impact, and the ongoing contribution that are expected for recipients of this high honor. When psychological researchers focus on the community, the setting outside of universities on which we focus the most is the school, a center of socialization and development, the public institution that plays a major role in shaping the future of individual students, our communities, and our society. Susan has devoted her scientific career to understanding substantive school issues and supporting action to improve. 3 of our major efforts have been to examine violence and protective factors among students in high-risk neighborhoods, to study effects to include students with disabilities in mainstream schools, and to examine violence against teachers and other school personnel in 2 large national studies. Today, she'll focus on the 3rd and arguably most important of these efforts, her path-breaking studies of violence against teachers and other school personnel. Based on her reputation as an outstanding school researcher concerning challenging issues, Dr. McMahon was first selected for the APA Task Force on Classroom Violence Against Teachers in 2008. Then in 2019, she was chosen to chair a new APA Task Force on Violence Against Educators and School Personnel. In these contexts, she's led 2 major research efforts to document the nature and extent of violence against teachers and other school staff. Done in partnership with 5 other national professional organizations for teachers, school psychologists, and school social workers. These surveys have drawn participation from teachers and other school personnel exceeding 10,000 for each survey. As it becomes available to the scientific, policy, and lay public, this work is assuming landmark status in defining the overlooked problem of violence directed at teachers, with which many are confronted on a regular basis. Dr. McMahon and her colleagues have determined that teachers are facing oral threats and physical violence in significant numbers, not only from students, but also from parents, other teachers, and supervisors. Of particular note is that following violent encounters with parents and students, principals and other supervisors often do not support teachers and may side with the parents or students. These experiences of lack of leader support are impactful and may leave teachers unsure of their willingness to continue in their positions and even in the profession. Dr. McMahon and her colleagues have published findings from their initial survey in the American Psychologist, a leading psychology journal, and presented them to national policymakers in Washington. To date, I can't believe these numbers, to date more than 544 million have been exposed to their findings, not only through the congressional briefing, but also through more than 1,000 media reports. It's exciting to see a DePaul scientist leading this national interdisciplinary effort. I have never encountered this kind of impact for community psychology in any context. In sum, Dr. McMahon's theory and research have examined several important substantive issues in contemporary schooling. It's been of the highest quality and has offered original insights. Its impact has had few parallels and has taken place over a quarter century. Dr. McMahon has published in leading journals in community psychology, education, and violence. Her work has been cited over 10,200 times per Google Scholar, and she's presented her research at universities and leading academic conferences in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, South America, and Asia, as well as North America. Taken together, her contributions to prevention of violence in urban schools, the inclusion of urban children and youth with disabilities in schools, and violence against teachers and other school staff make her one of the leading psychological scholars studying schools today. Given these noteworthy strengths, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Susan McMahon for the 2023-24 CSH Excellence in Research Award. Her presentation is entitled Understanding and Addressing Educator-Directed Violence Through National Research Collaboration and Policy.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris, for that lovely introduction. I'm very honored to be giving this address and humbled and also excited to share a bit of my research. So without further ado, we'll go on. Chris kind of noted a little bit about, my research is focused on schools. They really are complex microcosms of society and the central socialization of our children and youth. Also, violence and aggression are big issues there, just like they are around the world. The work environment is stressful for many adult stakeholders. And by working in schools, we have this sort of expansive potential for change. So that is kind of exciting. So I work from a social ecological framework. This is kind of common in community psychology and even broader than community psychology, but we can sort of think about sort of this nesting of ecological levels where the individual is nested within the classroom, nested within schools, nested within communities, and policy kind of affecting all of these things. But also there's interactions in between each of the levels, and sort of it kind of funnels down. So as community psychologists, we're sort of interested in trying to capture a lot of the different levels and kind of some of the influences that are happening, bidirectional influences. Also, I think there's a major focus on collaboration, mixed methods, which includes both quantitative and qualitative research, kind of together, informing one another, understanding the context. So it's not just about what's happening, but where is it happening? How is it happening? Why is it happening? Also improving school policies, practices, and diversity, equity, inclusion. So, as Chris mentioned, my focus has been on school violence. I've had a number of different projects, over the past 3 decades or so. But as he said, I became involved in 2008. My early work, even as a graduate student, I was looking at violence a little bit in schools and working with schools and public housing development communities. But in any case, it's a significant problem globally. And certainly when we look at it, there are poor educator and student outcomes, and that affects retention, satisfaction, achievement, mental health, behavioral health. And so the teacher perspectives have often not been included. And the idea behind this was then to expand the focus, and the APA task force, this American Psychological Association task force, that's how it was born out of. So to give you, and Chris gave you a little bit of an overview, but just this is kind of laying out this work since 2008, which I've been involved in. So this was this original task force, which I was a member, and we did a number of things, but including kind of collecting survey data. And then the new one where I'm chairing this is starting in 2019. And then we've done that sort of 3 waves of data collection in 2020, 2021. Then we had this congressional briefing in 22. Then we did a second wave of surveys in 22, and then a third wave in 2023, which we are still basically, I'm going to be talking a little bit about all of these except for this last data point, which we don't, we're still kind of organizing, and I don't have it ready to look at yet. So just a few little notes from the first task force. So we were certainly collaborating with APA. NEA is the National Educational Association, and AFT is American Federation of Teachers. And our first task at this point was to just look at the literature and say, how much is out there? And what we found was that there wasn't very much. Most of the research on violence was focused on student aggressors, and both students as both aggressors and the victims. And there wasn't very much examination of, the different types of violence. When they did look at teacher-directed violence, it was primarily relying on principal reports, which is a little bit underestimates things, because you might imagine they're not as directly in contact with it, but they also might have, it's like it reflects on their school and maybe them as a leader and all of these things. So these were underestimates. And then there weren't very many studies, and then the measurement varied. So we created and distributed some resources to teachers, and then we worked with the NEA and the AFT and the AP to distribute a survey. And this was an online survey, and it was about 3,400 teachers responded across all 50 states or 48 states. And then, and this, was mixed message. It was a survey, but it included these open-ended questions, which then we had this ton of data and very rich data that took us like a year per question to code. But in any case, here we have a few findings. Is that we found that it was very common. About 80% of our sample had indicated some type of violence or aggression. And then that varied depending on the type that you were looking at. So verbal threats were 43% of our sample, physical attacks lower, which is typically true. And then the offenders, we had, students were, the primary offenders. But if you look, parents, our 37% of our sample had experienced violence and aggression from parents and also colleagues. So it's a workplace where there's, sometimes intimidation, harassment, verbal threats, all kinds of different behaviors are happening, and people really, hadn't been looking at this. Lack of support from administrators, which Chris had mentioned, was one of our findings, and then also detrimental effects and retention issues. So this is just an example of kind of some of the frequencies of these. This is actually from the qualitative data, where we asked them about what was their most upsetting experience, what contributed to it, why did it happen, and we have the physical stuff being the most, and then verbal, and so sometimes we get, even reviewers might say, well, the verbal it's not that big of a deal, but it actually can be a very big deal. Threats, and then lack of support, we ended up categorizing that as a type of victimization, because the way that teachers talked about it, this is the advantage of open-ended qualitative responses, is they said, this terrible thing happened to me, but and then they described that, and they said, but the worst thing was my principal didn't even support me. They didn't believe me. They took the other person's side, and then they feel, alienated and frustrated, and they don't know what to do because they don't have support. So it was like sort of a secondary trauma. Okay, so then in 2019, this is kind of like a follow-up 10 years later. So we had the 2010 survey, then in 2020, so about 10 years later. And we wanted to then build on all the things we learned from the first one. And so the first one was just focused on teachers. This time, we were going to include, kind of the adult stakeholders in the school. So teachers, we had psychologists, social workers, counselors, administrators, staff, sort of the broad base, because also when you have teachers saying, my principal doesn't support me, well, what's going on with principals? What is their perspective? What kinds of experiences do they have? We don't really know because nobody's really looked at this. So that was a thing. And then this national online survey. So, we kind of elaborated, not just did they experience it, but how often did they experience it? So we kind of added some measurement things. We also had different qualitative questions about what their safety concerns were and their training needs, a lot more about their recommendations around policies and resources and, so we just sort of built on what we learned. And this is the task force. So you can see, we sort of have UCLA and Ohio State and Chapel Hill and Rutgers. Actually, Andrew is a graduate of DePaul. He worked with me as a student, and now he's at the Center for Justice Innovation. Frank Worrell at the UC Berkeley, he was the APA president. So we've had a wonderful team of scholars, and then of course all of their students. So it's been a really big kind of project to lead. So from the first study, we just really worked with the NEA and the AFT, but this time we sort of gathered NASP and NASW and School Social Work of America and MCA Strategic Data. And so we added more partners, which was also, gave us lots of advantages, but also sort of, it became, very sort of complex to lead. Okay, so these two data collections, these were kind of some summary statistics. We focused more on teachers. So the sample was 62% and 70% teachers. But you can see kind of staff, each of the different roles we have represented. And in the first sample, we had 14,966. And by the way, we were ready to roll this out in March of 2020. So, we all know what happened in March of 2020. It's when COVID hit. We had been gathering input on our surveys from all these different organizations. We've been going back and forth for months, and then, okay, we're ready to do it. And then that's what happened. Of course, they were like, we can't do that. And so we had to shift gears. And then we decided to build COVID into the survey so we could try to better understand what is happening during COVID, what happened before COVID. So this first time point actually includes both before COVID and during. We asked them to reflect so we can try to look at what's happening. And then this is sort of after the COVID restrictions. And we had stratified by region, school with the emails, so we got partners sent out surveys, but then we also had, we had this stratification to try to get this range across the country. So this is just, there's a map for every role, but this is just to show you, this is just the teacher one, but within the teacher, there's specialists, general education, special education, other roles. This is like just showing the participation as an example. Okay, so what do we find? These are overall rates of victimization of the frequencies, are people who experienced it at least once. And it's sort of during the academic year, but it changed a little bit based on COVID or not COVID. And so you can see this dark red is pre-COVID, which is 2019 to March of 2020. And then the orange is during COVID restrictions, 2020 to 2021. And then the yellow is after COVID restrictions, which is April to June of 2022. And what you can see here is the rates are high to begin with. They dipped in general during COVID, which very easy to explain because also people were, there were a number of schools that were hybrid online. That changes the whole nature of what's happening. And then they went back up and sometimes higher after COVID. Yeah.
Sorry, can you just this is a self-reported if they were victimized once during
Yes. Yes, and any type of victimization. So this is verbal and physical combined, which, the verbal thing included things like verbal threats, intimidation, sexual harassment, those, and the physical was things like having an object thrown at them, having an object weaponized, like you could weaponize a pencil, or you could throw a rock or a chair or something like that, or being physically attacked. So there were sort of, we had these 3 physical items and about 8 verbal items, and this is combined. And then I'm just going to show you a little bit. This is just teachers, so I've just pulled out the teachers because there's too much data to present, but just the teachers, and I've got a verbal and threatening and then physical next, but this is by offender. So you see the student offender, parent, colleague, and administrator offender. And so here again, you can see, pre-COVID, during COVID restrictions, and after COVID, and highest with the students, but there's a lot of stuff going on with the other people too, so it's not just students. And here's physical, and it looks quite a bit different, which is, so the overarching one is a little bit different, but the physical, we have the student offender is, a lot of it's happening by students. During pre-COVID and during COVID, things were a lot lighter for teachers, but after COVID, it's much worse. So it's a complicated picture, but we're sort of in trouble if we don't handle this and do something about it. Okay, there's some other interesting patterns. So we found an interaction effect when we were using logistic regressions. And here you can see the green line is administrators. So I'm back to the whole sample again. Administrators, the red line is teachers, yellow is staff, and orange is school psychologists, social workers, and counselors. And you can see pre-COVID, during COVID, and after COVID. And for verbal and threatening, administrators actually had higher rates than the other groups. But afterwards, teachers were far above. So things got much worse for teachers compared to the other stakeholders. And then here's the physical, a similar kind of pattern, although the administrators weren't higher to begin with, and teachers are shooting up. So one of the challenges is that we're talking about shortages in the workforce. And so we looked at what is their intention to quit or transfer. And this is people who said frequently or almost always. So we have mean reports, but I'm showing it in percentages because it's the easiest to kind of understand in a presentation like this. But here we have, this is sort of during COVID restrictions and after. So this is in 2022. And this is 2020-21. And so the rates are high, right? And they increased sort of after COVID. And they're the worst for teachers, but they're also pretty substantial across all the different roles. So pretty interesting. This is another, this is just a single item that I pulled out of an anxiety and stress scale to sort of say, what are people interpreting in terms of finding their work stressful? And again, you sort of see during COVID, teachers, it's like figuring out going online and all the things that happen with COVID, for sure. But there's a lot of stress going on. And then this is a structural equation model where we were looking at kind of what is going on in terms of the processes. And so this is actually 4 models kind of condensed into one to show you the findings, but we had verbal and threatening violence actually contributes to anxiety and stress, and anxiety and stress contribute to intention to transfer and intention to quit. And then these are the different offenders for the violence. So we have both direct effects to anxiety and stress from the violence, and then also indirect effects to quitting and transferring. And it's a similar pattern for physical violence. So the verbal and threatening and the physical is similar. I'm just putting up the one to kind of show you. And this just got published like in December. Okay, so finally, we also asked them about training needs, like what do you need? And we had 18 different strategies of like training, and these were the top ones that 43 to 64% of all school stakeholders said they need. So it's like, wow, trauma-informed practices, de-escalation strategies, threat assessment, restorative justice practices, behavior management, social-emotional learning approaches, working with diverse racial, ethnic, and cultural groups, and staff team building. So we have lots of people saying that they don't have the training that they need to be in the classroom, to be in their role in their schools. And so, again, and this kind of points to a number of things, including us, DePaul, as an educational institution. What are we doing in terms of training our teachers? what are we providing? And there's some really interesting data that shows that very, very, very little, like 3% of the curriculum is actually focused on dealing with, like behavioral problems. 97% is on curricular and other kinds of things. So we're not doing enough, and then people are being unprepared, and it's pretty a problem. Okay, so the qualitative assessment, I kind of mentioned some of these issues around experiences with violence, and we identified key themes across stakeholders, and I'm going to present 6 key themes and just a quote for each to give you a sense of what they're saying. So aggression and violence, that was one theme. I have been physically assaulted multiple times by students in the building, and they know that not only is there no one to stop them, but there will be no consequences either. I ended up in the hospital the last time it happened. Physical and mental well-being, the ever-increasing stress of the profession is taking the worst toll. Because the positives of this job no longer outweigh the negatives, I will not make it to my full pension. The third theme was education and student support. The process to identify students for special education or behavioral supports must be streamlined. It currently takes an average of 8 months for a violent, disruptive student to receive additional support services or be moved to a more appropriate setting. This is a really big problem. The placement issue also came out a lot in our original study. Three more themes. Policies. We need policies, procedures, and interventions to identify, address, and respond to student behaviors that lie outside the management capabilities of K-1 educators in the general education program. Resources. If states don't provide some sort of incentive, we will not have enough teachers to run the schools in our country. This was already a problem, and now it is worse. And community and societal concerns. Given proper resources, we could gain insight from all our communities to identify their needs and coordinate with community services and supports to mitigate those needs. So these are just some representative quotes of each of the different themes across roles. Okay, so a little bit about the congressional briefing. I had never done one of these before. I worked with some of my colleagues, had done them before, and it was a tremendous learning experience, and probably one of the most important things I've done in my career. It took about 8 months from the time we finished our first data collection, maybe 9 months, and we said, we're not going to focus on anything except policy. This policy brief was we said, we're not going to publish, we're not going to work on any papers, we're just going to focus on policy because the data, we think this will have really strong implications. So, it affected how we looked at the data. We, used graphics, high impact findings, legislation. The policy brief in itself was 4 pages with like 3 figures, 11 legislative kind of recommendations. And the technical report that went along with it was like 50 pages, so a lot more detail and depth about each of the things we had. And of course, we were collaborating with APA, their policy people, their media staff, and then all of our national partners. And that, there's a lot of coordination around that. And then the scheduling and invitations, we had to think about the Congress, when would work for them. Everything had to be done 2 months before that. We had, and then we had, for the actual thing, we had a senator and a representative. We have, APA leaders. I gave a data presentation, it was about 10 minutes of it. And then we had, speakers from the on the ground. So we had a teacher, a bus driver, a school psychologist, and a social worker who was also like an administrative leader. And they kind of shared their experiences each in a few minutes. So it was very cool. It's actually online if you ever wanted to take an hour to see one of those things. And some of the policy that we advocated for was to grow and diversify the workforce. These are a couple of legislation pieces that, they're still kind of ongoing, creating pathways to support mental and behavioral needs of students and educators. And then 2 more kind of themed areas, and these actually have been funded, funding educator training programs. These are 3 specific types of legislation, and funding school-based mental health programs. And they sort of added money to these, when these were passed in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which is $2.3 billion over 5 years for these 3 programs. Our policy, the Senior Director of Policy and Federal Congressional Leadership in APA, he said, we were one of the contributing pieces among many, many, many. Obviously, it's a big, well-oiled machine around how things happen. So we were one piece of data that we feel like we made a little small contribution, but some things are happening. Anyway, there's some recognition, and they've been very interested. Okay, and Chris a little bit mentioned this, but we have, we had a tremendous amount of coverage. The almost 1,400 articles, 749 million impressions. That was our reach. That was really sort of like the different news. Each audience of this kind of news kind of was that added up to that. And then they estimated that would have cost us about 19 million if we would have paid for that coverage, which of course we just paid in our blood, sweat, and tears, right? And then to kind of wrap up here, with some research practice and policy solutions. So definitely improving educator staff and leadership training. And this is pre-service, like the, universities around the country, around the world really need to be incorporating more of these strategies that teachers and other school leadership need. And then also in-service, what's happening, because they have required in-service trainings all the time. And so we need to better equip our school personnel to be able to deal with the challenges that they have, and then supporting them and with student, educator and student mental health assessment. So part of the thing is this is kind of a new area of research. So over the last 15 years, it's grown quite a bit for teachers, and now the school personnel is kind of new. So if we don't kind of look at it, we don't know to what extent it's a problem. We're not really going to be developing things. Now, the violence prevention interventions, including all stakeholders. Right now, there's, we could only find about 5 that had been are published doing anything with the teachers. There's nothing out there. So this is a huge area to develop. There are lots of school-based violence prevention interventions, but they're directed at the students, and they're just really not taking into account all the other things going on in the school. Appropriate resources, improving discipline, school climate support, and engaging Congress through relevant data, support for policies, and frontline experiences. So tons of acknowledgements. I will say, the DePaul, lots of DePaul students, Kaylin and Safa, and you said like a lot of these students some have graduated, some are still here. Students from other teams, people who participated, and certainly DePaul, and that's it. So.